I have some thank yous I want to offer. First, what?
Who are you?
I will. So first of all, my name is Lisa Sparrow, and in a minute I'm going to introduce the other members of the Inclusion Committee who are here. But first, a miracle of miracles, Fact TV has sent two great folks to film this so that we'll have it up on their website so people can watch it. So if you tell your friends how great this was and they're sad they missed it, you can say, oh, you can watch it on Fact TV. So Alex just walked out, but Bryce, thank you so much for helping set up. That's great. So members of the core committee of the Inclusion Committee, would you stand up? There's Dave Perry. He made those beautiful bumper stickers and the poster that might have gotten you here. Here is Cliff and his wife Wileen. Karen Blanchard is over there serving refreshments. And Sarah Waldo is somewhere handing it around, and she will hand you a bumper sticker if you want them. We'd love to have you take a bumper sticker, put it on your binder, put it on your water bottle, give it to your grandchildren to spread the love. I also want to thank Allison and Lisa, the two librarians. Where are you? There's Lisa. There's Allison. So how inclusive are we? So I want to tell just briefly this.
Couple seats right here.
Yeah, there's some front row seats if people want them. Come and grab. So almost a year ago, the town passed the Declaration of Inclusion. It wasn't all that, it did pass, but we know that there were some people who were concerned that it might stir up trouble. So we're trying to start with activities that help us remember our shared values, our shared history, and this is the first real event that we are hosting. And we hope to have others, and you are welcome to suggest what they might be. And if you really want to be involved and hear more, there is a sign up over there where you can give us your email, and I will very infrequently send you emails telling you what we're doing so that you can stay in touch, and you can also let us know your ideas or even come to a meeting if you wanted to help us plan. So without further ado, I think I've said everything. Oh, the only other thing would be that there are donuts and gluten-free cookies and cider, and I think you should just stand up and go get what you want if you need it. And I think you probably all know this better than I do, but there's a bathroom down there. So, and I think the best way is you just go down the stairs and walk to the end. But there is a bathroom and there is a lift if you need it. So we hope you'll be very comfortable as we learn about Westminster. I was going to hold up the book.
Oh, it's over there.
It's over there. Let me hold it. So I know that Jessie needs no introduction, that most of you are very familiar, at least with her books and possibly with her and with her husband. She grew up in Westminster, so who better to tell us the history of Westminster? She's written close to 40 books, and she has a lot to tell us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our very own Jessie Haas.
Well, I was going to just read the book, but no. So I wanted to start. How many people here live in Westminster? So where do you think you live in Westminster? Somebody, where do you live? Well, you live in Morrisbrook Road. How? Did you say North Westminster? Yep. Westminster West. Yeah. So show of hands. How many from Westminster West? How many from Westminster Center or East Parish? And how about North Westminster? Again, we got okay. All right. Well, that is really cool. So I want to just confess to a little bit of an imposter syndrome here. Even though, yeah, I grew up in Westminster, but I kind of don't think of myself as having grown up in Westminster. Like if people ask me questions, I'm like, oh, you should ask somebody who grew up in Westminster like Chris Harlow. And I'm like, yeah. But when I was a kid growing up on Patch Road, I kind of didn't know where I lived. Westminster West to me was the village, and we didn't live in the village, and I didn't go to Clare's school. And Westminster, where we are, was the other village, also known as the center, and I went to the center school. And so, but I didn't live there either. And so Patch Road, where was that? No man's land. Westminster West, through the 60s and 70s became more of a hippie enclave, and Patch Road was kind of more conservative. And, we're not Happy Valley where people are living in school buses and tree houses. And then there was Gageville. And to me, Gageville, if I ever thought about it, I thought it was part of Bellows Falls. I didn't know anybody from Gageville until 5th grade when the Gageville kids went to the Gageville school, and until their school closed and they came over to our school, bringing with them strange city ways. So all of a sudden in our school, people would raise their hands in class and ask permission to go to the basement. We were all like, the basement? That must be a sophisticated way of saying the bathroom, and we had cellars where we grew up, and what was the basement? Well, I believe they had the bathroom, like in this building, was in the basement in the Gageville school. So so the sophisticated city language. So my dad went to work every day in what I also thought of as Bellows Falls at Gaze Express, a trucking company that was later Holmes, and now I think it's ABF, or one of the ones with all the letters. And I was like, I always thought Gaze and Gageville had something to do with each other. And then there was St. Johnsbury, which was a town and a trucking company in Bellows Falls. So who knows what the grown-ups are talking about. And to me, Bellows Falls kind of began at the high school driveway. But I'm sure everybody here realizes that, in fact, it's all ours all the way to the other side of the bridge. And then we go on into BF and up Red Light Hill and hang a left, and we're back in Westminster in Gageville. And Gageville, I believe, is not on the map. So it's easy to be confused. And it's easy when you're up in that end of town, to feel like you're not still in Westminster, because we have this image of Westminster as rural farms, little historic villages. And that part of Westminster is light industry and a transportation hub, as it's always been through all the different kinds of transportation. Because it turns out, our big flat plateaus of land are great for agriculture, but those big flat plateaus are also really great for turning a truck around on. So they make excellent freight yards. So now I'm the president of the Historical Society, and I'm supposed to know all about this stuff, but I am still sometimes geographically challenged, and it's really easy to see why. So does everybody here, for instance, know where Allenville is? Oh, I thought everybody would know. So Allenville is on the back Westminster Road around the church that the Allens founded, and a lot of Allen family members live there. And then there's Lawrenceville. Do people know where Lawrenceville is? That is this side of Streeter Road, where a whole bunch of Lawrences live. Picknell Hill, which is way in the corner, the very north of North Westminster, has historically been where we had an African American community. And that area of town was called Blackville when it wasn't called something that began with an N. So, and I should say Gail Golick, who's a local archaeologist, has done some wonderful research on that community lately, that working upstairs, somewhere upstairs, in our Historical Society archive room, and has learned a lot about it. So we're hoping to help publicize her research going forward. So in some of the bigger hills here are their own little communities, like practically villes, like Hartley Hill and Davidson Hill. And then we have a couple people here from Windmill Hill South, which you cannot get to from Westminster. You have to go to Putney and take a dogleg up, unless you're Chris Harlow. And I was just told by Heather Taylor that they think of that as Westminster West. So I thought that was pretty cool. And it's so off the map that Putney plows their road, and we plow a piece of Putney Road in exchange. And then, of course, there's Westminster Station, which is a place and has its own post office. But I don't know, to this day, I don't know where Westminster Station begins and where it ends. I mean, the Westminster Flats is like right down bottom of Courthouse Hill and flat, but it's still flat at Westminster Station, and then you're in Westminster Station. And I was very surprised to learn recently from Susan Harlow that Harlow Farm is considered to be in Westminster Station. So where does North Westminster actually begin? I'm not sure anybody knows. So how did it get this way? And it's an artifact of colonialism, really. I mean, it was a place where Native Americans lived, and we know that because of some stone artifacts that we have found. But in 1735, after it was hoped that the French and Indian Wars had ended, Massachusetts owned this area at that time. It was part of a large swath of land, much bigger than Massachusetts is now. And the Massachusetts General Assembly created 28 6-square-mile townships between the Connecticut River and the Merrimack River. And they just kind of like cut them out of the landscape with scissors and send up surveyors to mark them out. So it's just a big square of raw land, which looks really neat on a map, but it didn't grow organically, and it wasn't considered organically. You know, there's these big hills in the middle. There's this long ridge. It's like organically, it's not going to hang together. But they didn't care, and they didn't know, and they didn't care when they created Township Number 1. Massachusetts was just crammed with English people who needed land to farm, and they needed to pay off their soldiers who had fought in the war. The land up here was considered empty, and it belonged to them. Only then it didn't. They found out after they did the survey, and a couple people had moved up here and built a cabin just down over the lip of the hill to the south. New Hampshire split off from Massachusetts, and it was decided that this land was part of New Hampshire, and nobody could figure out how the legality of did you own this place or not, was going to work. So they left. Later, New Hampshire was quite sure it owned it and regranted this town, regranted it twice, and then New York regranted it, and then it became a Vermont town, all without anybody moving anywhere. Or without changing any of the shapes of the lots and ranges and all of that. So settlement started again in the 1750s under New Hampshire, although many of the same people still owned the plots. And a few families came up, and again, they focused on that spot south of the village, which may have been a hospitable spot for a long time. There have been skulls and skeletons plowed up in those fields, 100 or 200 years ago when people were farming, that indicate that it may have been a place where Native Americans were buried. And it does seem like just a really gentle, hospitable site near the river and kind of nestled against the bank. So that's where the first couple of families with kids settled in. And then the war broke out again. And it was pretty hot around here for a while. There were raids on all the nearby forts. It wasn't safe to have a home outside of a fort. And so those settlers left. Some of them went across the river to Walpole for a while to stay with Colonel Bellows. And then some of them went to Massachusetts, went back home to Massachusetts. Some of them stayed in the fort down in Putney, the Fort Hill, and for several years, until it all began to die down again. and the English settlers poured back in, mostly from Massachusetts, a few from Connecticut. And they favored this side of the ridge, and for some pretty obvious reasons. First would be the river. It was really easy to get here. You could just canoe up the river, and that's how many of them got here. And then if you had anything to sell or anywhere to go, there was the river. So it was like the I-91 of that day. And then there's the soils, which are absolutely incredible on this side of the hill as the remnants of Lake Hitchcock. They're just so deep and so fertile. And you literally do have to go up into the hills to find a rock to prop anything up with. I've tried to help people prop up posts and things, and you're like, for somebody who grew up on Patch Road, it's almost incomprehensible. You cannot find a rock, and there's nothing to hold your post up with. So that's the kind of soil that many of these people were used to. If they had come up, through the Deerfield Valley, through the Pioneer Valley, and Hadley and Northfield, and the big broad meadows. And there were meadows here when they came. That's what some of the people that we know about who came up were a group of soldiers who were resupplying Fort Number 4 during the war and camped down somewhere near John's Car Corner. And they liked what they saw, and they came back after the war. And that was meadows, and it could have been old Abenaki meadows, or it could have been beaver meadows. And I have gotten in trouble for saying this before, but I'm just going to say it anyway, that long before any English settlers moved here into Vermont, that Native Americans had trapped out the beavers to sell the pelts to Europeans. And it was all part of this vortex that was created by the Europeans arriving and the massive plagues. 90% of the Abenaki in this region died of one of these, like chickenpox or measles. And then the Mohawks came and attacked the people who were left. So everything was in a great state of upheaval. So big shifts in the balance of power, and they had a perceived, probably very real need to buy guns. And there was a huge market. Here, the English, the French, the Dutch, everybody was buying beaver pelts. So the beaver were trapped out of here and, just all over the continent, really. And certainly we have no mention in any of the early accounts of the English settlers coming up here and finding marshes and beaver meadows. And yet, 250 years later, Westminster West is a beaver pond. So I think it's probably its natural state. But, it's taken 250 years to get anywhere close to what that is. So a few of the settlers moved into North Westminster, not very many, and a very few went over the hill to Westminster West. And one of the fun stories there is the Holden brothers, who were these two teenage boys, like 16 and 17, came up by themselves, made lean-tos, cut some trees, started their farm, went back home for the winter, and married, 16-year-old girls, and came back up the next summer. And the family is still there on Windmill Hill, and so they were among the very earliest out there, and on the really tippy top of one of the biggest hills that we have. And another farm that was farmed really early was Patch Farm, where David Major has his sheep farm now, which is kind of the opposite. It's for Westminster West, it's a huge flat basin. And so that was farmed early by a Wilcox, who was a brother-in-law of Ephraim Ranney, the patriarch of the Ranneys, who were over here. And you have to remember the land was really young. Land is as old as land is, but this land was only 15,000 years from being scraped and squashed by the glacier, with miles of ice on top of us, and the land actually, depressed, many, many, many feet from what it is now. And so, when the glacier disappeared, it was a barren, rocky, pre-fertile, there was a lot of crushed rock. And then vegetation moved back in. And so there'd been up on those ridges, there'd been 15,000 years of trees growing and leaves falling and trees falling over. And there was amazing soil up there as well as kind of really fluffy, deep soil. I was just reading a book about it's kind of like a field guide to the Connecticut River, which I really recommend. I can't remember the author, but it's Yale University Press. And he was talking about this, how that kind of soil, it just didn't even freeze very far down in the winter. It was just, it sounded like a feather bed. And so we look at where those people were farming now, and it's a crazy looking choice. But we don't live in the world that they live in. They got up there, and I'm sure you probably practically didn't even have to plow. You could shove like a giant raised bed, it sounds like. And so they built up there. I've heard it said that they built on the high places to help fend off Indians or Indian attack, but Indians climb hills just as well as anybody else. I don't think there's a lot of truth in that, but I think it's possible that the Abenaki people use the rivers as, those were kind of the highways, and if anything started up again, might be just as well to not be down there along one of those highways where it could get active. So they were up there, but the soil didn't stay there. The soil basically slumped down into the valleys. And this is a process that happened all over Vermont. And people followed it back down again. What are you going to do? They turned those ridges into sheep pasture and went west or came down the hill. After 20 or 30 years, it really did not take long for us to lose that soil. So the settlers were basically middle-aged couples with kids, almost all of them. And they had a lot more kids when they got there. And that's the thing about, why we ended up being a predominantly English country, that the English fertility rate was incredible. Because they came over here as couples. The Puritans thought everybody should be married, so they came as married couples with kids. They kept having kids, and Massachusetts was just packed full. There was no birth control and a lot of good food, and so they just grew and grew. So not very many years after the English got to Westminster, the older kids, the ones who came up with their parents, were looking to get married and start a farm of their own. So that was when the Westminster West started to fill up, as they started to, the second generation moved over the hills and started those farms, like the Rannies and the Holtons and the Harlows and many other of the old families. So it makes it confusing when you're trying to figure out what side, you're looking back in genealogy and trying to decide who lived where, because many of those families that I think of, like Ranny being a Westminster West family, but they started here in the East. People also tended to come in groups of, 2 or 3 related households. So like a grown pair of brothers might come with their families, or brother and sister might come with their kids. Many of them, they lived close together in Massachusetts, so they were all kind of intermarried, a lot of cousins, a lot of interesting juxtapositions. The one group that I always like to think about who settled on the flats, the soldiers who came during the war. So you had Joel Holton, and that's a name that's still here in this town, Azariah Wright, his brother Medad Wright, and John Norton. And so Medad Wright and John Norton married 2 of Joel Holton's sisters. So, so it's getting kind of tight-knit. And yet that family represented all the political choices in the run-up to the revolution. So Azariah Wright was a radical separatist Whig who started his own private militia. Medad was kind of in favor of New York, but he was kind of mildly a Whig. John Norton was totally loyal to Britain, and his place of business was called the Tory Tavern. And Joel Holton was just like kind of kept mum and didn't get involved in politics at all. And I kind of think it's a good thing I didn't have Thanksgiving dinners back then, because those would have been testing, I would think. And I would say descendants of all these people live in Westminster today. So Azariah Wright started his militia in the 1760s, and this was different than a normal town militia. It was a political, a revolutionary. And we've been told that the West Side had more people in his militia than the East. I'm not sure that's true. It's, with the family, the generations, it's hard to tell. What does seem to be true is that the very earliest settlers, the ones that came in the 1750s, were very heavily represented in the militia, and also that there weren't any Tories or New York sympathizers in what's now Westminster West, or if there were, they did not talk about it. So the first church was here in the east, in the village. It was it's kind of like in what would be the center of Route 5 now, but like parallel to where the town hall is. And that was a factor that pulled the town together. I mean, it was a 6 mile square, same as it is now, but as the only church in this part of Vermont for a while, people came here, people from Westminster, from Brookline, from the west, they came here in all weather, in all seasons, over that hill with all their kids piled on one horse and the parents walking. And, everybody was expected to be in church. Pretty much everybody was in church. And people could seem to be able to manage it in that day. And it was, in 1771, it was the most populated town in what's now Vermont, with a whole 478 people. About half of them were kids, and a lot more boys than girls. And we became a really important town when Crean Brush, a New York attorney from Ireland, came to town. He was born on the Irish estate of Dark Money. So I was like, you can't make this stuff up. And he was granted 6,000 acres here in town by the colony of New York. And in part, he was driven out of New York because of his stepdaughter, 12-year-old Fanny, who was the illegitimate daughter of a popular British officer, Captain John Montresor. And as she started to make her appearance in society as a young 12-year-old, he found that embarrassing, and he was powerful enough to make them go out of town rather than he having to go out of town himself. And they made it palatable to Crean Brush by granting him 6,000 acres here. So pretty good pull. And he came and totally reshaped the political landscape. We were firmly part of New York, and there was a new county here, Cumberland County, which was everything from Tunbridge to the Massachusetts border and east of the Green Mountains. And the Chester was the shire town where the county court met. But they had this, little rickety jail that people stayed in voluntarily, and if they didn't want to stay in, they just kind of pushed the cell apart and went out and got a drink. And it was just, so it wasn't very impressive. And Crean Brush was here and ambitious, so he pulled wires to get Westminster made the shire town. He got the county clerk dismissed for cause and himself appointed. He arranged for a courthouse to be built at the top of Courthouse Hill, big fortress-like courthouse. He got Cumberland County to be represented in the assembly, and then he rigged the election to get himself elected to the assembly. So bingo, he's back in New York, this time not handicapped by his family. And first pop out of the box, he wrote the bloody acts that made Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys outlaws. And so he was a useful member of New York government and very much hated locally. So, but he made Westminster Village a kind of the center of Cumberland County politically. So that's why when the county rebelled against British overreach that happened here, when ambitious lawyers that were looking to rise in the world, wanted to move to a good place, this was where they came because of that courthouse. So he leads to the massacre, to the Bradleys, who were, our family that produced a US senator and 2 members of Congress. And I won't say anything about the massacre, except I do want to, there's posters on the table about the Historical Society's commemoration of that event. It's the 250th anniversary this year. And we are celebrating over 3 days with 2 events in the afternoon, the 13th and the 14th. And then on the 15th, we will hold a candlelight vigil around dusk in the old cemetery at the French Monument. So there's posters about that on the table. So one of the differences in town showed up after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which we found out about like a day later. It's interesting to see how quickly news traveled, even in that time. Like the evening of the next day, Westminster people found out about it, and the morning after that, a dozen men from Westminster West marched to Cambridge, and most of them ended up fighting at Bunker Hill, whereas nobody from this side went. And I have never seen anything that really talked about what the difference was. The only thing I can think is that there was kind of a moving train over there in Westminster West. There was a company of Minutemen in Putney who were immediately going south, and it might just have been like, they're going, we're going, this is a no-brainer. Whereas people over here, some of them fought in New Hampshire units, and Azariah Wright, who was a crazy man, went off to attack Canada, not by himself, but with people like Ethan Allen. I would just note in the times we live in that this did not end well for them. So I just mentioned that. So it does stand out to me that the church at that time unified the town. And even when the roads were just paths and people must have been working themselves to the bone setting up their farms, the people from the West made that trek. Now I must say, this is sectarianism, but the flow didn't tend to go the other way. But as the families grew and as more people moved in, that meeting house must have become incredibly crowded. And when you think if most people go to church, and there's, in 1771, there's 480 people in town. In 1790, there's a lot more. And I imagine that a lot of times they came over and they couldn't all get inside. So there was a push for a church west of the ridge in the 1770s, and in 1784, the town set off the West Parish by a town vote. Now I have this map here. I'm going to see, let me see. So the parish line starts here, 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 and it kind of weasels over here. So there's a big, the northern half of the East Parish. The northern half of the East Parish is big and fat. The southern half of the West Parish is big and fat. So it makes a roughly equal halves of the town of following the line of the ridges that goes through the town. And then they started a meeting house over there, which is now a few generations of the Westminster West Church. They were getting ready to put it up near the end of Patch Road, which was where there was a village starting to spring up, Crook's Mills, that you may have heard Mary Sherbatskoy talk about, where the Crook family had grist mills and sawmills, and that seemed like a logical place to live. There was a store there. But then somebody gave land for the church where it stands right now, which as far as beauty and setting goes is a wonderful place. And so they built it there. It was rough finished in 1792. And then the village started to grow up around it. They even moved several of the buildings from Crook's Mills up there, by Oxon. And I believe the store that in my young days was Seymour's store, I think, is a building that was an inn at Crook's Mills, and then later a store there too. And so this kind of created the East-West division in the town, both officially and socially. And then that was helped along in the 1790s when there was a very large migration of families from Cape Cod. About 60 people came up from one location in Cape Cod, and they all moved to Westminster West. Again, this was middle-aged couples with lots of kids, and some of them were older couples that already had married children with kids, so 2 generations were coming up. And these are people like the Halls, the Clarks, Halletts, and Gorhams. And those names stayed on the west side of the hill. So I think that probably made a big difference in how the 2 sides of the town felt to each other early on. It wasn't any longer just oh, your kids live over the hill. It's all those new people live over the hill too. And a lot of the houses they built are ones that are still there, like the Halls built the house that I grew up in, and the Major's house, and Finn Campman's, and the Clarks built the house Chris Harlow lives in now, and they built Cole Streeter's house. And yeah, they made an impact. The church had been flirting with going Baptist, but these people were old school Congregationalists, and that switched the balance of power. The other cool thing about them is just because of the currency of the time, I used to hope that it was because somebody found a pirate hoard, but I don't think it was that. They came up with ox wagons, covered wagons essentially, and they bought their land with gold. They had gold, like, one of them had his child carry the gold, and one of them had, it in the flour barrel. But they bought gold, and they bought land with gold, and so the parish division was voted on by the legislature in 1797, which is kind of interesting, showing that, we think that separation of church and state is an important value to us, but it was a little iffy in those days. Property owners were liable to support the meeting house even if they weren't members of the church. Now, the meeting house was also used for town meetings, but the legislature had a say in how you divided your parishes. And in the 1800, the legislature decreed that our town meetings would alternate between the east and west sides of the ridge. And I don't know, what kind of grievance that was addressing, but there must have been one. And already that was like too big a hill for people. And I wonder what their parents, their parents said. Like in our day, literally you have to walk uphill both ways, barefoot, and you guys can't do this. So, but the town clerks also alternated for at least 30 years, and the town clerks were the ministers. So, the separation was really not there. So this is when the East Parish and the West Parish terms came into being, and it was shortened, the shorthand was EP and WP, so you lived in Westminster WP or Westminster EP, which I kind of like. The West Parish is now called Westminster West, and that's often shortened to West-West, though that was never said in my young days. And it was a strong enough division already that the town voted actually to divide along the parish line in 1803, and the West Parish would have been called Westbury, but the legislature didn't pass that, and so that did not happen. So meanwhile, North Westminster, which I have to admit is always, I always have a hard time bringing that back into my mind as a Westminster person. But the big noise in North Westminster was a man named Charles Church, who moved up, I'm thinking in the 1780s. I didn't look that one up. He's the person for whom Church Avenue is named. If you're ever up in Gageville and you wonder where the church is on Church Avenue, he's back there in the past. He had an enormous farm and mills in the forest and a shipping business up and down the Connecticut River. A lot of mills up there, a lot of factories. And he was practically a village in himself, his family. He had 20 children. And at one time, there were 12 of his sons and sons-in-law who were active in his business. So, he was a town. The other person who was big up there was Bill Blake, who had paper mills in Walpole and Bellows Falls. And I don't know, paper mills did nothing but burn down. So he got burned out in New Hampshire, he got burned down in Walpole, he moved to the forest, which is another one of those mysterious parts of Westminster. And he had paper mills there, and they burned down, and he built them again. And then other times they would get washed away by the freshet, they used to call it. Sounds like a lovely term for horrible floods. But the freshet sometimes washed those away. There was also an underwear factory up there for some reason. I don't know why there was an underwear factory. And many, many factories in that section of Westminster over the decades. And some, near the Covered Bridge Road, there was the Granger grist mill and a sawmill. And he was kind of Sanford Granger was a big builder of bridges, particularly in this area. And then the Gage basket factory moved in. And the Gages had a factory at the end of Morse Brook Road near the town garage, near where the town garage is now, and had invented this the Gage splint cutter, which cut the wood with the grain and made very strong baskets. And they bought Granger out in the late 1860s and built a big factory, like a 3-story factory there, and built this enormous house, which is still there, a 30-room house for the family and many of their unmarried employees. There's a ballroom in there. I mean, it's just it's an amazing house. And I don't know when that area started to be called Gageville, but it's been called that as long as I've ever known about it. And even the factory and the family are gone a long time ago. But that part of Westminster was always very connected with Bellows Falls, as it feels like a suburb of Bellows Falls, or just a little extension. When the trolley came in, that connected it even closer. And certainly was easier to go to church and entertainment in Bellows Falls. The kids, however, always did have their own, they didn't go to Bellows Falls schools, they had their own school district. And that was a division that was a little more organic in the town. There were 13 school districts, and they were organized around population density and whether it was easy for kids to walk to school. And that was where the real cutthroat democracy took place here in Westminster. I mean, I wouldn't automatically think that reading the records of school board meetings of 100 years or 150 years ago would be that interesting. But it's really amazing about the great tension about who they're going to hire for a teacher. Will they have a man or would they have a woman? That was a big cause of debate. And how many weeks would the school, it wasn't just automatic that there was a school year. They would decide how many weeks school would meet, and a man or a woman deciding to build a new school, you might as well just tear yourself in half. It was just appalling, the kind of things that go on, let alone move a school, paint a school. Somebody didn't bring the firewood he was supposed to bring. And so they'd have re-votes and re-votes. And they would one of them in Westminster West, that Brookside school, that went to 2 levels of neutral arbitration with neutral people from outside school districts and then people outside the town. And, it's just when you get nostalgic about those little school districts, remember that. And then also remember that, by the 1920s, there was serious concern about, the absolute squalor of those school districts, the privies, the lack of ventilation except for what naturally breezed in through the windows, and the lack of lighting. It oddly coincided with about the time women got the vote that they began to consolidate and clean up those school districts. So the school districts tended to be named for the most prominent family. So the Morse district at the bottom of Hartley Hill was Roe Morse's district, and he had that brick house up the road. And there was the Lane district near Morse Brook Road. So 13 of them. And then when the schools consolidated, that began to bring kids together again a little more. So there were fewer schools drawing in from a little bit broader geographic range. But it was easy to grow up in this town and not know a lot of the kids in this town, as I did. I didn't know Gageville kids until 5th grade. If you went through 8th grade in one of those schools and then you went on to another school, you could, if you were going to public schools, you could go to Walpole or you could go to Bellows Falls. And a lot of people from, especially from the center here, went to Walpole Academy. So you could really not know your own townspeople. Another thing that worked both for and against town unity was actually buildings like this one that we're in, the community buildings. So the town hall was built to be a community center. It has where the Historical Society has its museum. It's got a stage and amazing painted curtains, and was used for dances and plays and weddings. And was a lively little center, and then became rather dilapidated. And when Mr. Butterfield left money for the library in this building a little over 100 years ago, he ran out. He didn't have as much money as he thought he would be able to leave because he had a disabled son he had to care for. So there was a gap in what it was going to cost. And George Dascom, a local lumber magnate, more than made up the difference by building this amazing building. And it has been a wonderful community center for over the years. And our board member, Barb Greeno, told us a lot about growing up here in the village and how this building was open all hours. And you could just come in. I asked her what was the thing she remembered most about being in this building, and she just said, running and, hanging by your legs off the stair rails and just wild social play. And there were movies, and there was, basketball and the men's meeting room, and of course the library. There were community showers, so that when people didn't have showers in their houses, people could come here and take a shower. And however, it was a building that was given specifically to the East Parish. And the East Parish actually incorporated, because it got this building, the village, first the village incorporated, and then the East Parish incorporated. And although I suppose people in the West, if they had come, they wouldn't have been chased away, it really was, a tightening of this community. Now, over in Westminster West, there was also a little community house. Both of the parts of town had granges, and then there was a big, about the same time that this building was built, a community house was built up in North Westminster, and did the same, filled the same kind of function, but it all kind of tended to draw those communities in and dilute the draw of coming together in any one part of the town. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but about that time, Gageville tried to become part of Rockingham, and it tried again in the 1950s. So when you fast forward to the 60s, and I think that's the time when I always had the impression that the differences in town really started to take place. I think that's not true, but differences happened then as well. So as we've talked about, Lake Hitchcock, this soil has the Lake Hitchcock soil, and it's amazing for agriculture, and has stayed in agriculture. So the big farms stayed here. Now, I was part of a bus tour that Paul Harlow took, talking about the farms along these flats and how many of those big houses had bigger barns than we see now attached to them, and they were milking cows. And then but economics of dairy just never seem to get better. They only get worse. So when the farms were required to have bulk tanks, when people, there was a creamery here in town that picked up cream for 20 years maybe, but when that went out and then Hood stopped picking up milk in cans, and the little 12 cow dairies went out, And here in the east part of town, it was kind of easy to absorb the fields into the next farm. So somebody went out, somebody stayed in business, and then you had medium-sized farms. And then the economics just got worse, and then the mid-sized farms went out. So like when I was a kid in the 60s, I could think of 11 farms milking cows within about a couple miles of where I lived. And only actually one of them is milking cows today. Two of those big farms support David Major's milk sheep, so they are still a dairy. But so those little farms were just winking out, and they were a lot more for sale than things were over here. So when you had, there was a poll in this area of people interested in international affairs with the experiment and Wyndham College. So people from away also, having an idea of going back to the land and wanting to raise their kids in the country. Westminster West was a natural place for them because, for one thing, it's closer to Putney, it's closer to Brattle Brothers, and there's big Impossible Hill in the way. And so those little farms, many of them were bought up and broken up into smaller lots, and people, maybe did a kind of farming for a while on them and raised their kids and sold off lots. But the politics of it changed. So some of the houses are fixed up. You should get Gordon and Mary to talk about what their house was like when they got it, so that was a new generation of one of those older houses. But there definitely was a big social change. And through the 60s and 70s and early 80s, there was a real difference, kind of a social difference in the two sides of the hill, which I think has changed, softened. Those differences have softened recently. I don't think there's as big a difference as there was, but it is still to some extent. And then there's the postal situation. We used to have 3 post offices, unless I'm missing a fourth, but I don't think so. I don't think Gageville ever had one, but Westminster West used to have its own post office, which was in the library or sometimes in the store or sometimes in somebody's house. And so then there's the zip code situation. And, that's how you say where you live is your zip code. So there are a lot of people who live in Westminster West who really honestly think they live in Putney because it's 05346. And I have certainly razzed Peter Shumlin about his business called Putney Student Travel, which is in Westminster West. But that's really his parents that are to blame for that. And in North Westminster, a lot of people think that they live in Bellows Falls or Saxon's River, going by the zip codes. And those also tend to reflect the town where we go shopping or go to work. The other point of confusion for all of us is our kids go to the Bellows Falls Middle School, which is in Bellows Falls, and then to the Bellows Falls Union High School, which is in Westminster. And it's confusing. The Union School District agreed to keep the name Bellows Falls so that there'd be continuity for the sports teams, but it's one more way that we've gotten confused about our identity. So it's no wonder that there's a divide, and I used to blame us. I used to, really think, we could do better, and this is all stupid, but I didn't grow up knowing about all of these, this history of how we've kind of always been divided. But when you start to look across the centuries at the patterns, it quite possibly is just natural, like that this is the way organically, if it had not been a square scissored out by Massachusetts, but if people had moved in here organically, I think that these communities would have been developed and be different towns. And we've certainly acted that way over all the years. And I'm always amazed, as I said, I have imposter syndrome about whether did I grow up in Westminster, but my elders like Barb Greeno and Ruth Grandy, who also grew up in Westminster, were like not quite sure where to find the Westminster West Library. And I'm just always kind of surprised by that, but it's, it's how it is. It's how this town is. And I don't think it's anybody's fault, actually. And a lot of us, I'm perfectly at sea when I'm trying to find something in Gageville. And so, I don't know what we're to make of it. It's a big, diverse town, and it's hard for us to feel united, and it always has been. I think it's really wonderful how many people are here tonight, and that there's, as part of the inclusion committee, like including each other is really something we have to do on purpose, I think. And the public school, I think, does draw us together, because finally there's one public school and one private school, because the Compass School is also in Westminster. And we do manage to get together for town meeting, and like at the far edge of Westminster for some of us. And I think things that draw us together, like Westminster Cares, the amazing volunteers. I haven't done it for a while, but the drivers who, just drive so many miles on some of these very difficult roads to bring elderly people hot meals. And then you have the listers and the highway crew and the select board and the town manager who know the whole town and have to think about the whole town. Select board members from both sides of the hill. I don't think we currently have anyone from North Westminster, but we certainly have in the past. And Cheryl Charles, the chair of our school board, lives in way up on Davidson Hill, so that brings that diversity in as well. And so I wanted to end on this note, just thinking about our times, and I'm spending a lot of time right now thinking about 250 years ago. So I just ran across this thing in the big book the other day while I was preparing for this talk. I'd forgotten about it. But the road outside this building was known as the King's Highway in 1775, and if you want to know more about what that meant legally, Dan Axtell is your man, but it was a legal definition, and it was part of us being part of the Great Britain. And in the 1929, it was Route 5, and then it was a federal highway when it was paved. And when it was paved, it was dedicated to international peace. So the name of the King's Highway was restored, and the dedication committee wrote cables to King George IV and to the Prime Minister, who happened to be visiting America at the time. And they made prominent mention of the Westminster Massacre as the first bloodshed of the American Revolution, which you wouldn't think would be that diplomatic, but so this is what the committee said in their cable. The name the King's Highway will be retained as an expression of the kindliness and good feeling toward the English people, our forefathers. It is our heartfelt wish that the peaceful and pleasant relations between Great Britain and America be always as they are today. And the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, responded in kind and called for permanent peace between us and Great Britain and among all the nations of the earth. And so the good feeling was expressed here, and the Congressman Ernie Gibson and Governor Weeks called Westminster the cradle of American liberty. And I think the good feeling that they inspired in almost 100 years ago might inspire us to see what we can do in this smaller sphere to just soften the little rifts between Westminster EP and Westminster WP and North Westminster. So thank you. I'll answer some questions if people have any. And before I forget it, again, there's some information about our massacre commemoration coming up. And I want to be clear that that is open to everybody. We're hoping everybody comes who wants to come. What is the date again? There are 3 dates, so March 13, 14, and 15. So the 13th will be in the afternoon. We'll gather at Greg Gay's farm at the corner of Sand Hill Road, which was Azariah Wright's homestead, and march up to Courthouse Hill. The 14th, we'll gather at the courthouse marker and commemorate the nonviolent retaking of the courthouse after really what can only be called the atrocities of the night before. And then on the 15th at dusk, we will gather. The museum will be open at 6, and around 7, as dusk falls, we will gather in the cemetery at the French monument, the French Houghton monument, because 2 people were killed, for a candlelight vigil. And again, everybody's welcome. I would caution you to look at our website closer to time and make sure nothing's shifted, because it is March, and these are outdoor events. So things could change, but we really hope to see a lot of people here to, we live in somewhat similar times, I would say, where things are happening and we don't know what's going to happen next. And we need to take courage from people who had courage in the past. So it might be a good time for this town to gather. And I'll also mention that I have a book coming out, a novel about the Westminster Massacre and about Fanny Allen, who wasn't Fanny Allen then, but who lived here in Westminster, pretty much next door to the courthouse during the time of the Westminster Massacre, and was a witness, and so a novel about her life. And I think that's all I had to announce, except that if I'd been a really organized person, I would have brought membership forms for anybody to join the Historical Society who wants to, but I'm not that kind of person. However, you can go on our website, which is westminstervthistory.org, and join us there. And we would be delighted to have anybody who is interested in, there isn't a job you have to do, but just the sense of mutual support would be really cool if anybody wants to join. It's cheap, it's $10 for individuals, so it doesn't cost much. So any questions that I can answer on, we might shove them off on Dan or Chris. No questions, wow. Oh, yes, hi, Jimmy.
I just saw that in your survey at the end of the townwide institutions, I think you ought to mention the fire district.
Yes, I had in my head to mention the fire district, thank you. Right, and the fire district started being an East Parish thing, and that it took some time and stretching to get it to cover the whole of Westminster, as it now does. I should say my mom and Eva Mondin and Joanna Golden integrated the Westminster Fire Department in the early 1980s when they were trying to get more people to join from the West, and they were surprised when it was 3 women. And there was a long, contentious discussion, but they accepted them, and my mother is still a fire warden in town to this day. Yeah.
I'm wondering how the arrival of the railroad in the 1840s affected Westminster.
The railroad didn't get here till the 50s. One of the things it did was kill the taverns. There were many taverns in this town, so there were, like 3 taverns on this part of the street, and one down in where the red farmhouse that's now white. You might not be able to recognize it. The red farmhouse was a tavern. Near Allen Brothers, there was a tavern. They were, up on all the hills, because you weren't going anywhere fast, and you needed a place for refreshment and maybe to stay the night. And along with the temperance movement, just the fact that people were now moving on the railroads, and they were moving in a straight line up and down. They weren't, there was a much less kind of going up over the hills on the little roads. So the taverns were really pretty much wiped out by the railroad. It did the same thing that in our lifetimes 91 did. I think it made it much easier to zip down to Brattleboro. Like the Bradley family were not very comfortable with things like religious revival meetings, and they would scoot off to Brattleboro when there was a revival meeting in town. And it just was like easy to zip around. So it did make a difference. It did bring in an influx of Irish people for a while for and it was Irish families, interestingly. I had always thought it was just a gang of men who worked along and built the railroads, but we do have a diary from somebody who taught school up the school at the bottom of Hartley Hill, and she had Irish kids in her schools, which I presume was part of the railroad and maybe families who ended up staying. So that's the kind of change they made. And also, once the railroads were here, they displaced riverboat traffic as far as shipping went. So it was easier in a different way to ship goods up and down. Yeah.
I hope people keep asking questions, but I just want to express how much of a treasure you are for our community to know so much and for us to be able to hear from you. I know we clapped already, but how lucky are we?
Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned, I believe, twice a lake. I don't recall which is the name of the lake was, but I'm wondering where this lake was.
Lake Hitchcock, it was everywhere. It was a glacial lake as after the glaciers melted. It was basically the river valley, but it was pretty deep. Like Kernhattan was kind of the shore. We would have been underwater even here, and it's interesting that and Rocky Hill, the Orchard Hill now. There's some of the places where archaic Native American artifacts are found kind of coincide with the edge of Lake Hitchcock. So I think people came here pretty quickly, as maybe they were here before, while there was still ice, but definitely 15,000 years ago, as soon as the ice was gone, there was a big lake. Now, I have to admit, I was reading this amazing book about the Connecticut River and the Connecticut River watershed, and I get how the river fish would have come up here, but I was just, this is a complete sidetrack, but how did the lake fish, how did fish come back after the glacier? There's some things that I don't understand, but anyway, yeah.
To clarify, Lake Hitchcock extended from Middletown, Connecticut to Lyme, New Hampshire. And the remains of a natural dam in Middletown, you can still see them.
Yeah. Yeah, and so all of these plateaus are part of it. It's part of how it drained off, essentially, and what is left. So as you look at the landscape of out the East Parish here of the shelves that you see along the river valley, it's all an artifact, and it did leave an amazing quality of soil. So it was it was quite something. There was another hand. Okay. So great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was really exciting. Cool to have all of you.